She smiled back and said, "Carter Morris, as I live and breathe." Everything about Carter Morris was understated, cool. His curly hair was tucked stylishly into a knit beanie. He wore a plaid shirt, an African beaded necklace that frankly very few men could pull off, a pair of dark denim jeans, and biker boots. Sitting next to him at the bar, Emma could smell that he was freshly showered and shaved. He had always been like that, smooth. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "This is one of my favorite spots," she said, "but I live in New York. I should be the one asking you, what are you doing here?" "I'm meeting with my publisher about my next art book," he said. There was silence then. She looked at his ring finger, empty. He looked at hers. She was still wearing the Flintstone size upgrade you Rock Omar had gotten her in Paris 10 years before he died. They looked at each other and it all came back. How good they had been together. How young they had been when they parted. Look at God, Emma thought. Look at God. 1975. Amelia Vaux first met Carter Morris in Central Park. It was July, and Bob Marley and the Wailers were headlining a free concert in the park. Lavinia Fox, a British friend from school, had convinced her to go. The plan was that the two women would share a picnic lunch and a bottle of wine and check out the music and what was sure to be an array of cute single guys. But within minutes of their arrival at the park, Lavinia took off with a Rastafarian wearing aviation sunglasses and a dashiki, declaring, "Back in a tick." An hour later, Emma was sitting solo on her picnic blanket with the strong realization that she had been ditched. As the opening acts blared, slightly out of tune, Emma kept telling herself she'd leave after the next song. But she stayed on. Later, she would realize that a heavy-duty contact high had contributed mightily to her lethargy. The performers on stage were all black, but the crowd was mostly white. The cultural consumerism reminded her of stolen rock and roll riffs and the whitewashing of Motown. The masses loved the music, but did they care about the people and the communities that the music came from? When the lead singer, Bob Marley, took to the stage, Emma was mesmerized. He was so different than the artist Emma and her friends listened to while they were dancing. His vibe wasn't anything like the urban cool of artists such as Stevie Wonder or Marvin Gaye. He didn't display any of the disco sizzle that gave such a spark to singers like Donna Summer and Natalie Cole. On stage, Marley talked about how all he'd heard since he'd arrived in New York was talk of a financial crisis, but it seemed to him that the city was in the throes of a spiritual crisis. The crowd roared, and he broke into a stirring rendition of "No Woman, No Cry." Although Emma knew that she wasn't the only girl there to feel it, it felt in that moment he was singing directly to her. As Marley sang, Emma thought of all she had lost, how much she had risked to start a new life in New York, just as the city seemed to be crumbling around her. But would she make it? She looked around at the thousands of people swaying to the reggae beat. Would any of them make it? Emma had so many dreams. After work, on the nights when she didn't have school, she sat up for hours, listening to old Nina Simone albums, scribbling in her notebooks about what she imagined her life might be one day. She'd grown up in a time when colored girls weren't encouraged to dream. She knew if the folks back home ever got a peek at her diaries, they would laugh harder than they would at a Richard Pryor comedy show. But Emma always believed in the gospel of Zora Neale Hurston. You had to jump at the sun if you ever wanted to get off the ground. Bob Marley and the Wailers had just started singing Get Up, Stand Up, when a little bit of sunshine beamed right at Emma. He was Billy D. handsome, and he was more dressed up than most of the people on the Great Lawn. It was 95 degrees in the shade, but he looked as cool as could be in a white linen shirt and a pair of perfectly flared jeans. "I'm Carter," he said. "Mind if I join you?" She didn't mind and told him so. That night, she learned a lot about him. "My dad was a jazz musician," he told her. "Nobody famous. He took off before I was even born. My mom held it down. She's Swedish. She's a painter, and she lives upstate in a little town called Kingston. She teaches art. She makes art. She's a free spirit." When he asked what she did, she mentioned that she worked for a brokerage firm. In that moment, she wanted to be a free spirit too. So she said, "I've got a day job. I go to school at night." "What are you studying?" he asked. She didn't say finance. She couldn't. Not while Bob was singing rebel music. She looked up at the night sky and said, "Astronomy." "That's cool," he said, and there was real admiration in his voice. She looked across the park and said, "I'm hoping to get an internship at the Hayden Planetarium." That was the thing about Carter Morris. From the beginning, he made her feel different than any man had before or since. The edges of what was possible always seemed to stretch a little further when Carter was around. They spent the entire summer together. They visited tiny downtown galleries and all the big uptown museums. They went to see a show at the Whitney by Betty Saar, marveling at how her work mixed together African spiritualism, surrealist technique, and folk stereotype figures like Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben. Emma read in an interview that Saar once said, "I'm the kind of person who recycles materials, but I also recycle emotions and feelings." And Emma thought, "Me too, Betty, me too." Carter was the first person Emma knew to truly embody the idea of 6 degrees of separation. He seemed just a few acquaintances away from anybody you might want to know. One night, they found themselves hanging out in a back room at Max's Kansas City with a crowd that included Mick Jagger and David Bowie. Emma didn't know it then, but it was the beginning of everything in New York. The art, the music, the fortune, and the creativity. That would turn the city around. Recklessly, Emma, who was always careful with money, spent half a paycheck on 2 slinky jersey dresses and a pair of glittery heels that seemed to be the uniform of all the downtown girls. In those dresses, she and Carter did the hustle all around town. Her boyfriend was so good looking. He was always impeccably dressed. He was the smoothest dancer. He reminded Emma of Bob Marley when he danced. Carter moved like the music was inside of him, not the other way around. It was beautiful to watch. It was even more electrifying to be in his arms when he moved like that. Now there was one more thing Emma remembered as she sat in the Lido in Harlem, next to the man who had been her lover more than 40 years before. Carter had a sweet tooth. After they'd been out dancing, he never wanted a slice of pizza or a chic steak frites the way so many of the other club goers did. They would go back to his apartment in Little Italy, which he rented from a friend of his mother, and they would eat vanilla and caramel gelato straight from the container. When he kissed her, his mouth was cool and sweet. Emma thought that they were beginning a life together. Emma thought, but that September, Carter announced that he was moving to Rome. He had a friend who had an apartment with a spare bedroom. He planned to get a job in a gallery or as a waiter. It doesn't matter. It's Rome. They were eating ice cream in Mount Morris Park. They'd walked all the way from Emma's building up to Harlem. Listening to Carter say he was leaving, Emma felt like she'd been dropped out of a plane and she was free falling through the air. "Come with me," he said, as if he was asking her to take the subway from Manhattan to some cool dim sum spot way out in Queens. She looked at him and knew it was over. She didn't need a suburban life and a white picket fence. But she didn't want to live a life that was filled with that free-falling feeling. She'd already spent too much of her life navigating through corridors of chaos. The mistakes of her youth that had almost cost her everything. She had come to New York to plant herself firmly and, God willing, to bloom. Carter was built differently. He was somehow already complete. Everything he needed, or seemingly wanted, he carried within the confines of his skin. It seemed like he could be at home anywhere and with anyone. "You're not coming?" he said, as if he thought in her silence she'd been seriously considering the idea. She shook her head. "No." "I'll come back for you," he said. She had willed herself not to cry until she was back in her own bed, far from where he could see how much he had hurt her. A hurt from which she was sure she'd never fully recover. 5 years later, she met Omar, who was the opposite of Carter in every way. And it was then, in the summer of 1981, when she was in the throes of falling in love with Omar, Carter returned. He showed up at Libby's house in West Tisbury as if he'd never left. "Carter," she said, willing her heart not to leap as she came to the door. "Come with me on a boat ride," he'd said. He looked as handsome as ever. He was wearing a sun-faded turquoise t-shirt, a pair of khaki pants, and loafers without socks. "Today?" she asked incredulously. She wanted to kiss him. She wondered if he still tasted like gelato. "Today, as in now," he said, smiling mysteriously. She glanced at Libby, who motioned for her to go. She leaned in and whispered to her, "Pack an overnight bag." She did as she was told. When she stepped out to the driveway, Carter held her in his arms and kissed her. Being in his arms felt like he'd been gone for days, not years. She still wanted him. She counted how many dates she'd been on with Omar. 5, 6. Certainly, this wouldn't count as cheating. He was driving a classic Land Cruiser. Borrowed, he explained, from a friend. She threw her monogrammed duffel bag in the back seat. He drove to the dock at the Vineyard Haven, and they walked out to a beautiful sailboat. Emma, meet Amazing Grace, he said, beaming. Wow, what a beautiful boat, she said admiringly. Libby's family chartered a big boat every summer, which they sailed out to one of the little islands off the vineyard and then prepared a giant clam bake on the beach. But this was different. She'd never been out alone on a yacht with a guy before. When did you learn to boat? She asked. He said, I spent the last year on the Dalmatian coast. I was working for a cruise line there. Emma was embarrassed. She didn't even know where the Dalmatian coast was. It was while I was there on these incredible boats that I got the idea for this project, Carter explains. It's called Horizons. I've been using this large format camera to photograph the thin line where the sky meets the sea. We were boating off of Trieste, and I looked out at the horizon, and it reminded me of a Mark Rothko painting. You think blue sky, blue water, it's all pretty much the same wherever you go. But when you photograph it, it's never the same. In Trieste, the sky photographed a pale white, almost like a bowl of milk, and the sea was a silvery gray. He took out a few prints to show her. She was moved. They were so elegant and beautiful. I decided to do a series. I'm going to spend the next year photographing horizons all around the world. And what will you do for money? The words came out of her mouth before she could stop herself. He looked hurt. Actually, my grandfather, in Sweden, passed away earlier this year. My mother gave me part of the inheritance as a grant. She told me to stop waiting tables on the cruise line and go make some art. Emma looked at him then and wondered how many black men had ever heard those words. Stop waiting tables. Go make some art. Not enough. No matter the number, she was sure it was not enough. Someday she wanted to give someone that kind of inheritance. How many zeros would she have to put on a check for someone to feel that free? She put her bag in the cabin underneath the stern. As a girl, she'd always wanted that kind of fancy, store-bought dollhouse her grandmother could never afford. The cabin reminded her of those dollhouses. Everything was perfectly scaled down to fit the space. There was a tiny table with 2 bar stools on either side, a miniature fridge, a 2-burner stove, a small sink, and a little built-in love seat. Only the bedroom was out of scale. A big bed with no room to walk around it, just 2 small lamps on either side of the bed and a large skylight. Carter pointed up and said, perfect for looking out at the stars. Emma gazed at the stars, and when she looked back at Carter, he was already wrapping his arms around her waist. Pulling her close, Carter kissed Emma, but this time something was different between the two of them. After a smoldering kiss, his fingers immediately began searching her body, his tongue exploring her most sensitive, delicate places. Emma was hungry for him. His touch felt so good, necessary. Emma lost her breath, then began breathing faster. Her body quivered. She was on fire. She could smell his cologne, and its scent of sandalwood, cardamom, and vanilla made her completely surrender. He was stiff, hard, and ready, and she was soft and dripping wet between her legs. Emma moaned, and with each touch, each taste, her moans increased. Before she could catch her breath, she threw her head back in complete surrender, and Carter slipped inside her. He froze, she froze, now locked into each other under the stars. He held her body tighter, pushed himself in deeper. Carter and Emma's eyes met, and their souls began to speak as their bodies moved. The rhythm first mimicked the waves under the vessel, but in minutes the movement was a crescendo. The sex quickened in a way that felt dirty but so good. Emma's body responded with wanton lust. Carter fed her with his body and used his tongue to lick and taste Emma at the same time. As his rhythm hastened, she could feel a flutter inside. A release began. She was ready. She whispered in his ear, "I want you to come, Carter." He kissed her and continued thrusting until they both orgasmed. Emma felt completely satisfied, but slowly she began to feel an ache in her soul. The ache took over the desire she just felt seconds before. They fell asleep in each other's arms, naked. Before long, they woke, dressed, and went back to the lounge on deck. He put a speaker onto the deck and flipped on a switch. Bob Marley started singing "No Woman, No Cry." "Our song," he said. Then she watched as he expertly turned the engines on and steered them into the open water. The two lovers talked and laughed as if nothing had happened just a few hours before. There was an unspoken understanding. Emma had no regrets. She loved Carter, but they were on two different journeys, worlds apart. Carter smiled at her, and even though she now knew that she would never settle down, he was a forever kind of love, and she was happy he'd returned. The trip on the yacht felt like a gift. She had given a piece of her heart to Carter that she could never get back, and that was okay. She knew she could love more than one man. She knew this because she loved herself. In the years to come, his Horizon series became the acclaim of the art world. In the early 90s, when the Museum of Modern Art did a retrospective, she went to see it alone. She and Omar had been married for 10 years at that point, and they had very few secrets, but Carter was one of them. Walking into the low-lit rooms where Carter's photographs were displayed, she felt almost as if she were seasick. The images were so large, each covered an entire wall. Taken in as a whole, you felt like you were in the center of all the great bodies of water in the world. Through Carter's lens, the Arctic Ocean flowed into Lake Superior. The Atlantic poured into the South Pacific. In one small room, a film played. She recognized it immediately. She remembered being on that boat and Carter taking out the video camera. She'd watched him steady himself, filming the sun setting into the sea. There had been a moment when he turned the camera on her. She had been wearing the white ruffled swimsuit, the one she wore after July 4th when she tanned enough that her skin had turned golden brown. She sat in the museum, watching the film of the sunset on the vineyard, and nervously expected to see herself, laughing and gesturing for him to turn the camera back to the riot of pink and red that was the sky that night. But he had edited that bit out. He had kept their secret. That had been nearly 30 years ago. She'd kept track of his career, amazed at how he moved from success to success. He'd not only become an acclaimed fine art photographer, he'd also directed a movie and opened up an architecture firm where he did everything from designing homes to making furniture. She knew he'd never married. He had one child, a daughter who lived in Berlin with her mother. He dated fashion models and actresses. Sometimes Emma saw a photo of him in a magazine or a camera panned across his face at an awards show like the Oscars, and she wondered if anything they'd shared had been real. Had that piece of her heart been well cared for? Had it just been a fantasy, a dollhouse love on a dollhouse boat that she'd made up in her head? Now he was here, sitting next to her at Lido in Harlem. He looked the same, a little gray in the beard and salt and pepper in his hair, but he was still so handsome, so much that 230-something women at the bar kept looking back and forth from their phones to Carter as if to confirm that it was really him in person. "You have some fans," she said. "Please," he said. "Not a woman in this place can hold a candle to you." He looked at her appreciatively. Emma knew she looked good for her age, but it had been a long while since a man had looked at her the way Carter was looking at her, with hunger in his eyes. "I can't believe that I'm running into you here," she said. "I can't believe that it's taken this long for us to reconnect," he said. "I was sorry to hear about your husband." "Thank you," she said, wondering if Omar would be okay with this. They had never discussed the notion of life or love after their marriage. Even after his diagnosis, it never came up. Theirs was a true love. When Emma tried to imagine a life without Omar, all she saw was darkness. Then, little by little, after his death, she realized how much she needed to do to sort her girls out, to make things right, to ask for forgiveness for the secrets she and Omar had kept. She had never thought of Carter Morris as someone who would come back into her life, but now he was here and she knew right away that they were at the beginning of something, a reclamation. When the girls were younger, on rainy afternoons on the island, Omar liked to play board games. The game of life was his favorite. They'd all put their pieces at the beginning of the winding road, filling the space with degrees and babies and houses. Then, at the end of the game, the big reward was retirement. Omar always winked at her when she landed at the retirement home seconds after he did. "Beans and cornbread," he'd say, referencing an old Louis Jordan song. He always said he and Emma went together like red beans and rice or beans and cornbread. But now Omar was gone. It seemed like God had lifted her out of the retirement village and put her right back at the starting line and said, "How about it, Emma? Fancy another go around the board?" Emma and Carter ordered a plate of squid, ink linguine, and ate it, Lady and the Tramp style, with 2 forks off one plate. "So where have you been the last 40 years?" she asked. "I know a little from the art magazines, but I want to hear it from you." Carter smiled. "Well, I spent the whole year after I left you in the vineyard on the Horizons projects. After the vineyard, I went to Mexico to the Sea of Cortez. Then I went to New Zealand because a girl I went to school with married a farmer there, and they had a guest house where I could crash for free. I wrote a bunch of grant proposals, got a few, then I moved to Japan for a few years." "Wow," Emma exclaimed. Carter ordered a bottle of wine and poured them both a glass. "Your turn. Somehow you went from astronomy to banking." "I read all the articles about how they called you the Witch of Wall Street. They just kept thinking of inventive ways to be racist." She should tell him she was never studying astronomy, or maybe not. What did it matter now? "How long were you married?" Carter asked. Emma blushed. 33 years. He raised a glass. "That's a long time. You deserved it. That kind of forever love is precious and rare." "What about you? Are you in love?" she asked boldly. I have a daughter, but I never settled down, Carter said. I think I have a different vision than a lot of people. I didn't so much want a wife as a conspirator. And you never found that kind of woman? Emma asked. Carter leaned into her, his voice sexy and just above a whisper. To tell you the truth, I think I stopped looking. I shut the soulmate part of my brain down. But seeing you here tonight, I can't help but wonder if God didn't have this in mind all along. Em could feel her heart beating faster. It was as if she were 22 again, standing on the lawn of Central Park, ready to fall down the rabbit hole of a crazy love. Emma felt her face get hot. What are you saying exactly? She asked him. I'm saying, do you have any interest in spending the rest of your life as a conspirator with a vagabond artist who only took 40 years to get it together? Emma didn't know what to say. Carter Morris, you haven't seen me in 40 years. Who knows if we're even compatible? She couldn't believe they were having this conversation in a public place. Carter said, Emma, I'm a grown man. You are beautiful, intelligent, and kind. You can't underestimate the importance of kindness. Do you remember after the boat ride when I asked you to come with me to Mexico? You turned me down for the second time. We stopped at the carousel in Oak Bluffs, and you were like a little kid. You insisted that we both buy tickets, and every time the ring came around, you leapt at it. When you got the brass ring, your face lit up like Christmas. I'm looking at you now, and I see that same girl, the one who got the ring. When I asked you to come with me to Rome, Mexico, then to Mexico, I was asking you to marry me, to spend your life with me. But I didn't know how I was going to make a living from month to month. I couldn't figure out what was going on with my art and whether an artist, with air quotes, was something I'd ever be. I was too cowardly then to ask you to bet on me, to roll with me through all that uncertainty. I was too afraid that without money or a plan, I'd be like my dad, the moody, creative brother who splits in the middle of the night when shit gets hectic. But I'm past all that now. I've made a life, and I've made art, and I've made more than a living. I walked into the restaurant tonight and saw you sitting here, and it was like God saying, one more ride around the carousel, Carter. I'm not leaving here tonight without the brass ring. We can have a long engagement, but I will not wait to propose. I love you, Emma. You've always had my heart. You still have it. Then Carter Morris got on one knee, and out of the corner of her eye, she saw dozens of cell phones pop out to capture the moment. I think God is telling me that it's never too late to reclaim love. Amelia Tanner, will you marry me? Then, because Harlem restaurant managers are nice with their playlists, as if on cue, Luther Vandross's Never Too Much blared across the restaurant speakers. Emma didn't know what to say. It was the last thing she was expecting when she took the ride to Harlem for an early supper on a Friday night. I won't get up until you say yes, Carter said flirtatiously. Then, not because she felt pressure or because the whole restaurant was watching, Emma said, yes, because yes was in her heart. Carter stood up and flashed his rock star smile to the crowd that had their phones trained on him. She said, yes, y'all, champagne for everybody, or Prosecco. A brother's not trying to break the bank before the wedding. There was a round of applause at the restaurant as the restaurant settled down, and Carter and Emma returned to their seats at the bar. He asked the bartender to pour them 2 glasses of Vin Santo, the sweet Italian dessert wine. Emma smiled when she heard Carter say, hey man, what kind of ice cream do you have? The bartender said, We've got 4 types of gelato: vanilla, Turkish coffee, salted caramel, and strawberry with black pepper and balsamic vinegar. Carter said, "Bring us 2 scoops of everything you've got." She told Virgil he could call it a night. She would find her way home. If he was surprised, he was the soul of discretion and didn't show her. It was after midnight when Carter dropped her in front of her apartment in an Uber. Before she got out of the car, he politely asked, "Would it be okay if I kissed you? Good night." Emma nodded yes. It was just as she remembered from all those years ago. His kiss was both cool and sweet.